Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome to you. My name is Richard Orme, I'm from the DAISY Consortium, and I'm your host for today's webinar. Okay, let's get started. DAISY webinars are on the theme of accessible publishing and reading, and we're always pleased to hear from you about the sessions you'd like us to feature. Today we're bringing you one of the most frequently requested topics, that of describing images in publications. This is work that's been done for many years by special libraries and adaptation services. It's great that many of you are attending this webinar. What's a relatively recent development is that publishers are producing books that already include alt text and extended descriptions. We thought it would be interesting to ask some of them how they organise this and what advice they would have for publishers who are just starting out. So I'll be back after the presentations to share what they told us. But at this point, I'll hand over to our expert panelists who will not only tell us about guidance and best practice, but also explore the promise of technology.
Hi, this is Valerie Morrison, and I work at the Center for Inclusive Design and Innovation at Georgia Tech. I've worked at CIDI for about 9 years now, and our team specializes in converting textbooks and course materials for higher ed into a variety of accessible file formats. Prior to working at Georgia Tech, I taught for 10 years at UGA. I taught English composition and literature. And so my writing skills really do come in handy today when we're talking about how to write and describe images with alt text.
Hello, everyone. My name is Charles Lapierre, and I'm the technical lead for the Diagram Center and Born Accessible at Benetech. We have a number of initiatives working in accessible image and descriptions and technology to support that. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Gregorio Pellegrino. I am a computer engineer, and I'm in charge of research and development projects in Fondazione Lia. Fondazione Lia is an Italian foundation that promotes the culture of accessibility among content producers. So, for example, publishers and bank insurances companies and so on, and to the end users. And we are part of the DAISY Consortium. I will tell you something about automatic image description using the tools available for image recognition. Thanks.
So today we're going to be covering the basics of image descriptions for different publications, training and best practices, using AI to automate image description, and if we have time, we'll talk about publisher approaches to alternative text. So I'll be starting today, and what I'm going to be covering is I'll be offering some practical tips and advice for writing effective alternative text. I'm going to start with some basic examples and give some specific images and some basic charts and infographics to get us all started on best practices for alt text writing. So I always start my trainings on writing alt text with this, which might be my favorite image of all time. This is a cat, obviously, or maybe not so obviously, because when I have used this image in different in-person trainings, you would be surprised how many people fail to mention that there is a cat in this photo. So when you start approaching writing alt text, people often ask me, well, how do you start? Where do you even begin? And I try to tell people to first summarize what you see in one general informative sentence. Try to capture all that information up front. It's very helpful for someone to have a framework right at the beginning and then build your details, work from general to specific. It helps in information retention and getting something from working memory to long-term memory. So when I've used this image in the past, people often get lost in the details. They'll talk about The cityscape, people will mention this boat in the foreground, the buildings, the turrets, the spires. They might get around to the cat. I've had people mention that there's a cat in this photo, but they never talked about how big he was. And so really you want to make sure that you are foregrounding the most important person, or sorry, the most important content right away in that first or second sentence. So I have written my alt text for this image, and my example is an enormous cat photoshopped into the waterfront of Istanbul. The cat is reclining on one elbow in a very human pose. Now, of course, I could go at length talking about how funny I think this is, how cute and fluffy he is, the fact that people have told me this is actually a real cat and it's a she. Her name is Tomboli. I could write a dissertation about this cat, but I'm going to try and keep it short and sweet and concise if possible. So knowing where to start is half the battle. Knowing when to stop, I would say, is the other half. I usually tell people best practice is the length of a tweet. And I want you to keep in mind that JAWS and NVDA are the most popular screen reading softwares out there. And so often the default settings cut off reading the alt text out loud after a certain number of characters. So you really do want, it is imperative to include the most important information first if you want to make sure that it is read aloud. That being said, of course, depending on the context or the audience, especially with very complex graphics or educational material, you can get longer and longer and longer. And so I do have some tips on how not to go too long in your alt text, maybe take it out of the alt text, and we'll get to that in a minute. So, general tips: always use proper grammar, spelling, and punctuation. Do not include any hard line breaks in your image description, and hard line breaks are when you hit enter. So if you hit the enter key, you're creating a hard line break and a new paragraph, and the screen reader might stop reading. Screen readers also recognize capitalization and punctuation. So if you write in correct language, of course I taught English, so I'm all about that. Just be consistent and clear in the way you write things out. Try not to include acronyms or symbols. Try and spell them out, write them out if possible. Again, work from general to specific to provide a framework for the listener. Provide information in multiple modalities if possible. So this is when your alt text starts creeping up on you and you get 4, 5, 6 sentences in. Think about, instead of writing it all as alt text, if you have the ability to edit this publication, providing some of that information as a caption so that your alt text doesn't have to go as in detail, doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting all by itself. Or take some information out as a table or a graph, and I'll show you some examples of that as well. And then also another way to keep things concise is to read around the image and see if the content is described by the surrounding text, and then your alt text can just fill in the gaps and be a bit more brief. So here are some examples of very simple images, a photograph of Martin Luther King Jr. And when I'm training people, I try to, excuse me, recommend that if it's a photo or a portrait of a person, all you need is the person's name. Unless they're doing something very specific or contextually important, you can just list the person's name. Of course, I'd be tempted, especially considering everything going on in the world right now, to talk about his pose, about the gravity of the image, maybe insert some of my own feelings or thoughts, maybe speculate about what he's thinking about. but I always try to encourage people to stay neutral and objective and just describe what they see. So if it's a person, all you need is the person's name. On the right, I have a magnified image of the human coronavirus. That is the alt text that I've written for that image. You can just describe it in one sentence, but again, depending on the audience or the context, if this were appearing in a biology textbook or a journal article in science, you might need to add further details about the spherical shape or the projections, just depending on your audience and your purpose. So here's an example of a very simple bar graph. It's a lot of information. It's very simplified in its layout, and it has very muted colors, which I appreciate, but there's a lot of information in this graph. So you want to start with general. So you would name what kind of graph it is, and then the title. So a bar graph titled US Population by Race. Then describe what's on the horizontal and vertical axes. And then once you've set the terms and described what the graph concerns, then move into the specific data. So my last sentence here is going to start parsing the specific data set in that first bar. Here's an example of where I would say multiple modalities would be even more accessible for someone. So I would like to see this chart accompanied by a table full of data for each of these different ethnicities and the percentages. That way someone could scroll through or tab through the different cells and not have to listen to long, long paragraphs of alt text. It's more accessible for the user.
Valerie, did you want to just read out the alt text that you've got up on the screen there?
Yes. So the alt text that I've written, and I haven't completed it, I just started with the very first bar, but the alt text that I've written is a bar graph titled US Population by Race that compares the percentages of Black, Hispanic, White, and other races in the United States for the years 1990, 2000, projected 2025, and projected 2050. In 1990, there were 76% white, 9% Hispanic, 12% Black, and 3% other. In 2000, there were ... So I have an ellipses there because if I kept going, this would not all fit on the slide. And so this is an example, again, of where I would have the alt text just be that first sentence if possible, and then accompany it with a table so that someone could scroll through that table and tab through the different cells and parse through all of that data in a more leisurely way. Another thing that I would like to advocate is that when you are approaching alt text, especially if you've never written alt text for the first time, is that you are always focusing on the meaning and not so much on the appearance. So if there are symbols, and in this example, we have a physical reaction in my image, and whenever I use this as a training image when people first start writing alt text for me. I get a lot of information about the redness and the squiggliness of this arrow and the symbols and the circle with the plus sign and the circle with the minus sign. So it's much more clear to someone just to describe this as a gamma ray, a positron, and then you're not caught up in all the details of the appearance of the arrows or the appearance of the symbols, and you're focusing instead on the meaning. When you're finished writing your alt text, I would say take a step back if possible and think about what the visual implications are. What is the overall visual impression of the graph? Often someone has graphed this data in a particular way to make a point. And so in this example, I have a bar graph titled Maternal Mortality in Selected States. And it doesn't even include all 50 states, but yikes, Georgia, the state that I am in right now, is by far and away has the highest maternal mortality, over double, more than double any of the other states listed. So the reason being is someone was probably trying to make a statement about Georgia's maternal mortality rates. So once you've written your concise alt text description, step back and think, what is the visual impact of this graph? What relationships are implied here? And try not to leave out what the visual impression is for the listener. And then finally, I want to talk for just a moment about cognitive load. And it's often called auditory fatigue. So if you are describing images and writing out all those descriptions, you are providing a lot more listening material for someone who's using screen reading software. So try not to overwhelm the listener's working memory. And this again is why I keep advocating for being concise whenever possible, because of all the research we've done on how information gets from working memory into long-term memory. So this infographic is probably one of the more complex infographics I've come across. It contains basically everything in the universe. And the title of the infographic is Universe Infographic Elements. It contains so many different charts and bar graphs and figures and diagrams. I could describe this very simply in one sentence, just saying an infographic, naming the title, and then describing the range of different graphs and elements contained. But if I were to go through and comprehensively provide all the data in this infographic, it would take me several hours. So this might be, again, another good candidate for something where you provide that information in multiple modalities, working, again, from general to specific, and then filling in the details as needed. And with that, I will pass things over to Charles.
All right, thank you, Valerie. All right, today I'm going to talk to you about our diagram center and the number of resources we have available to you on image descriptions and images in general. On our diagramcenter.org website, we have a making-images-accessible.html page. And in here we have our Poet Image Description Training Tool link, our image description guidelines, accessible image sample book, and various training modules. So, and I want to dive into our Poet Image Description Training Tool, which I think that you'll have, this will be a great asset to anyone that's actually doing image descriptions, especially for the first time. So on our website here, the Poet training tool, we have a training module on when to describe an image, because not all images need to be described. And then we have how to describe images, and giving multiple different examples there, and then practice demonstrating what you've learned, and then getting some feedback from what an expert would recommend. So I'm going to go into when to describe. And there's a number of different examples here, from math to images, cartoons, charts, and I'll pick the last one here, which we have a map of the United States here with all the states are labeled with their names, and then different colors associated with different states. So let's try to figure out what this is and if we need to describe it. So, which of the following best describes this image is the question that's given. And is this a photo or a drawing or a cartoon? Well, actually it's a map. So I'm going to go down and select map and then click on next. Now it's asking, what's the purpose of this image? It provides visual interest only, or needed to understand the subject matter, or is it functional? Is it an icon or a button or a header? Or does it provide information needed for understanding the subject matter? Well, yeah, that's exactly what it is. So let's click on that and click next. Now it's asking us, does the image provide information essential to understanding what's not available in the surrounding text? Well, this is just the image. I need to see it in context. Well, now we have a link here to see the image in context. So I'm looking now at this article, and it's showing me about national diversity of the death penalty in the various states. And we see that, you know, California's in red, Texas is red, Florida very high, and then other states is like a lighter blue or a darker purplish color. So looking around the text surrounding this image, I don't see that information. So that information is only in the image, and it contains a legend key of what the different colors are for the states. So yeah, the answer to this question is absolutely we need it doesn't, the alt text or the image is not described by the surrounding text of the document that is associated with. So I'm going to click on yes, click next. And now it's asking, does this image contain embedded text? Well, obviously it does. It has a key and everything. But for the sake of example here, I'm going to click no. And any point along the way, if you click the wrong answer and click next, it says, oops, wrong answer. Please try again. Okay, so this basically forces you down the path to getting right to the correct answer. So if you make a mistake, you're informed along the way. So yes, this has some text, and we'll click next. And then finally, it's asking, would a text description adequately convey the main idea of this image? Well, obviously, in this case, yes, we need some type of description. So we're going to click next. And now it gives an overview and some comments from experts. This image is a map, requires a text description, or even a tactile graphic might be beneficial. And then it goes into detail about the surrounding text, provides high-level description, but lacks details available only in this image. And so it basically describes why you need an image description here. And then it says, as a reminder, you know, this image contains a key that also needs to be made accessible. So with that, we, you know, and you can go through these trainings on all these different types of images here. Also, we have how to describe images as part of the training tool. So that was our other option here. And we have like general guidelines, context. You need to have the context. Consider your audience. Is this for a high school level, grade school level, or university level? You know, so, and be concise, be objective, like Valerie was telling us. General to specific, again, what Valerie told us earlier, start generally and then get more specific, and then your tone and language. And then we have other resources here on how for different types of images. So art, photographs, cartoons, chemistry, diagrams. So you can go through here and flowcharts. You can see what and test your image description training skills, and all of these have what an expert would do as well. Okay. In addition to that, we have a resource called our Accessible Image Sample Book, which is also on our diagramcenter.org website, and all of these links will be provided to you all. And in here, it shows how to put those image descriptions into like an EPUB book or an HTML page, and then also describes some extended descriptions, how to do that. So that book is very, very informative. We also have a number of different guidance, best practices for, you know, style and language, for formatting, and then specific guidelines and all the different types of images, from cartoons to drawings to photographs, etc. And finally, wanted to just briefly mention our diagrammer, which diagrammer is a framework for making images and graphics accessible. So think of diagrammer as like an object that contains not only the image, but its associated alt text description, extended description, maybe a simplified description for a person with a cognitive disability, could it contain a tactile graphic of that image, or maybe even a 3D model. So this framework or this object of the diagrammer, you could send that whole thing to a person, and based on their specific needs, they could either just pick out the image and its text, or get a tactile graphic, etc. So parts of diagrammer have already made its way into the W3C and the web standards. And also we're thinking about incorporating this into our image share project, which is a repository and registry of images and their descriptions and alternate modality formats of those images. So love to see this continue on that work. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Gregorio.
Thank you, Charles. Hi there. I will try to tell you something about our experience on how to use artificial intelligence to try to automate image description. So last year, as Fondazione Lia, we carried out a pilot project in partnership with the University of Siena that was developed by the student Tommaso Dringoli. The goal was to test the many tools that were available in the market that you can see in this slide. For example, Microsoft Computer Vision, Cloud Vision API, IBM Watson, Amazon Recognition, Cloud Sign, and others, to try to use them in the publishing world to simplify the process of creating born accessible publications. So to simplify the work for publishers and content creators. As I said, there are many tools available, and almost all of them work well for photo recognition, even if sometimes they confuse photos of Chihuahua dogs with muffin photos, as you can see in this slide, which is really, really funny. And some of these tools returns only tags, others return a human readable description. Some are really cheap, others are really expensive. So we tested them all to try to figure out how to help publishers in making automatic descriptions. The fact is that in publishing, we have many other types of images other than photographs. We have work of arts, charts, infographics, icons, flow charts, and so on. So we found that some tools are better than others to describe certain type of images. For example, the work of arts, to identify work of arts images containing texts, photographs, logos, and icons. And some tools are vertical on some particular features. For example, OCR or entity recognition or color and shape identification, etc. So we thought of splitting the description issue, the description problem, into two parts. The first is to understand what category of images it is. And the second part is to describe the image itself. Then we realized a prototype that extracts the images from an EPUB, identifies the category using a classifier that we trained, and then tries to describe the image using the most appropriate tool, depending on the category. So for images of text, we choose one tool, for photographs another, and so on, to end with the complete description, so the category and the description itself. The overall accuracy of the results was 42% on the classifier and 50% on description. So not really high, but also not really low. It was, I mean, we can improve that. And to improve this work, we are now working with the Italian National Research Center to create a broader and all-comprehensive taxonomy which will help us to go and define more accurate data sets that will enable us to train the classifier. And I think that with new taxonomy and new data sets, the overall accuracy of the classifier will improve a lot. Thank you, and I leave the stage to Richard.
So we've heard a great introduction from Valerie there and benefited from her experience of teaching people image description skills. And Charles showed us some free tools and resources at the Diagram Center, and we heard about the promise of technology from Gregorio. As I mentioned in the introduction, we also reached out to some publishers to hear about what they're doing at the moment, and also what advice they have for other publishers who are embarking on image descriptions themselves. So we're going to hear from Cogan Page, from Macmillan Learning, from John Wiley, and from W.W. Norton. First of all, from Cogan Page, Martin Klopstock, who's the Director of Operations there, says that the creation of image descriptions, it's part of their default workflow, and it's handled actually by the vendors. So one vendor has their own image description team, and the other one uses freelancers with different subject matter expertise. The vendors handle the outsourcing at agreed rates, and at Cogan Page, they had discussed whether to involve authors, but they felt that this had a few disadvantages. It would be difficult to get a common methodology which would be applied between dozens of different authors. The images that they have at Cogan Page typically are not sufficiently specialized, so these could be maybe in medical or STEM publishing where this is a requirement, and so maybe the author level expertise isn't so required. Moving then to the recommendations from Cogan Page, Martin says it's really important to develop your own vendor guidelines. This helps to clarify your own thoughts, as there may will be issues that are specific to your publications and would benefit from the publisher's take on those and how they might impact on image descriptions. His second point was that developing a small library of exemplar figures and tables can be really helpful to get vendors to provide their descriptions to them and then compare the two and see where the fit is. This ensures the vendors have fully understood what you're asking them to do. Descriptions can really quickly become expensive. So Martin mentioned that to control costs, think about imposing some limits on that and also having limitations on the number of long descriptions. His point here is that you have to manage this process and carefully make sure that costs don't overrun. And for quality assurance, Martin mentions the importance of spot checking vendor descriptions on each of your publications. This could be done at the proof stage, along with the other usual checks. We heard from Rachel at Macmillan Learning. And at Macmillan, image description authoring is part of a mix really for them, in that they use all the different approaches of having them originated by the authors. They outsource them as part of the ebook creation. They do use description specialists that have specific subject matter expertise and also in-house authoring. So what are the lessons and tips then from Macmillan? Rachel shares that they found that iterative improvement rather than aiming for perfection has allowed them to make impact for a far larger number of users. Then they're able to use customer feedback on what they've done already, and then they can then improve on what already exists. Rachel's advice is not to err on the side of either too much or too little, and we heard about this from Valerie. If you're describing an image just to get it done, then the description is likely not sufficient. Similarly, if you've written a novella about the oceanic shade of blue of a naval officer's uniform in the plating of a battle, you've probably gone off in a rather creative writing tangent. And lastly, it may not be visible on a page, but this is still your content. So no matter what method you use to write it, remember that you need to apply the same rules that you use for anything else you publish. So think about, for example, diversity and inclusion in your language. Are you using the appropriate pronouns? Is it appropriate or necessary to identify race, gender, ethnicity, etc. in the alt text? And how are you identifying these traits? So apply the same rules that you have for other content to the description text. We heard from Svea at John Wiley & Sons. For alt text description, this is outsourced to description specialists. All the alt text is written by subject matter experts who've been trained in how to write appropriate alt text descriptions. And Svea says that ideally all image descriptions need to be written by someone who understands the particular subject, as well as how assistive technologies and the user experience impacts the writing. Svea says that at John Wiley, all the alt text also goes through a QA process to ensure it's well written and adheres to their own Wiley requirements. And the QA validation can include many hurdles, but it's really important to speak to end users to ensure that you're on the right path. That type of validation could also help you uncover where there are gaps in your policy. They don't do in-house authoring, and it's mainly outsourced as part of the ebook creation. Svea points out that there are images that are reused in other supplements or maybe questions. So these go through an additional editing process to adjust the alt text to fit the context for that supplement or that question. So for example, if an EPUB image is reused in a question, the alt text is adjusted to make sure it doesn't give away the answer, and also it may be modified to include a more detailed long description. Svea also mentions that, as we heard before, all alt text needs to be validated. And we heard previously about the recommendation around involving end users. So Svea's punchy recommendations are: become familiar with the different image concepts, understand the differences between short and long descriptions and when to apply these to an image, create those internal requirements around style and language to create that consistency in the learner's experience. Remember that alt text shouldn't be used to teach, but to describe, and don't forget that spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Validate, 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 and validate, Svea says. From W.W. Norton, like with the others, we asked them how they currently manage image descriptions. And they said that normally these are outsourced to description specialists. And they say that actually they'd argue that authoring good image descriptions is more difficult to scale than meeting many other accessibility requirements because it requires specialists. And they do this towards the end of the book's production cycle, since images and the context surrounding the text may need to be finalized and may change during the process. So it needs to be final before they can produce the descriptions. Some of their editorial assistants do sometimes author the image descriptions. It's not the norm though. They tend to do it when a non-STEM book is revised or a small number of images change. And they say that STEM and complex materials always require a specialist. And he gave a shout out to some of the editorial team at Norton, who in the time of COVID, they're doing more of this image description themselves and more in-house. On this question of whether the alt text can be originated by the author, we heard that it's happened once or twice, and that's because the author volunteered to write the descriptions themselves. They don't tend to ask authors to create image descriptions themselves because they usually don't have a good handle on how to write them, and they prefer that the authors spend their time on content development. It can be difficult enough getting authors to meet their challenging content development deadlines, so asking them to add image descriptions on top of that just isn't really feasible. So let's look at the advice that they would give for others. So aim for an equivalent experience of how people consume images visually. And one analogy or metaphor that's given here is, think about a short description as the experience of glancing at image in passing, and structured extended descriptions as the experience of deciding to closely look at an image. Write guidelines for yourself and for other authors so that your chosen nomenclature is clear, whether you use alt text, image description, short description, and so on, so that the usage is clear and consistent in your practices. There's no single solution for all images. Best practices and examples will help, but ultimately authoring alt text requires quite a lot of executive functioning and decision making. So thanks so much to the publishers who took time to talk within their teams and summarize their current practices and advice they would give to other publishers who are starting out. So that brings us to the end of the presentation slot itself. I'm putting up on the slide now contact information for our presenters. So this is Charles Lapierre from Benetech. He can be reached at charles.l@benetech, benetech.org. Gregorio from Fondazione Lia can be reached at Gregorio, Gregorio, Pellegrino, Pellegrino, at FONDAZIONELIA.org. And Valerie can be reached at valerie.morrison, MORRISON, at design.gatech.edu. Thanks so much to our presenters, but stick around because now we'll move to the Q&A session. So, first question we have off the blocks is to the panel. Is there any difference in writing image descriptions that will be consumed by speech using a screen reader, as we heard several times people referring to in the sessions, or reading through a braille display? Who'd like to tackle that?
Sure, I'll take that. Charles here. Whatever is spoken through a screen reader will automatically be sent to the braille display as is. They're in sync with each other. The text-to-speech, the reading of the screen reader drives the braille display, so they're in complete sync. Now there is some work being done to actually have what's spoken be different than what's on the braille display, so you could have shorter abbreviations because braille displays are limited in the number of characters that can be displayed at one time. So there's work being done in the standards space on that, but that hasn't happened yet. So they're the same for now.
Valerie, the image descriptions that are done in your unit and in time, are they used for embossed braille as well as in a digital publication, or does it tend to be only for use in a digital publication?
The ones that we are creating in our eText department are primarily used just in digital format and not in braille. And often when we are faced with material that someone is going to be using braille display or braille, we have a braille department, and so we collaborate with them on that. And there was another question, I don't want to jump ahead, but there was a question about the anatomical images, and that's something that the braille manager, Guy Tolles, and I would talk about extensively, how to describe an image using a tactile image versus text. And so these are decisions we're usually making with the end user in mind.
Thank you for that. Well, it's a kind of linked one, which is about the use of the alt text by something other than a screen reader. We have the question from Colton, which is that from the testing that they do, it seems that screen reader software reads alt text, where you would kind of hope it would, but the large majority of text-to-speech software does not. So this would be kind of read aloud type products or utilities. What are the panel's thoughts on whether alt text should be read by text-to-speech software, and thinking about whether or not that might support comprehension? Who'd be willing to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll take that, Richard. We've been seeing that even some read aloud functionality allows the user the option to turn on or off the ability to speak the alt text when going past an image that has alt text, which I think is great. Basically put that into the hands of the user's user preference. And I also think that I know that we're working with W.W. Norton on this progressive enhancement of image descriptions, so that when an image has its description, as well, like as alt text description, as well as a extended description, that for some users, they want to be able to see that in context with the image and see both the alt text as well as its extended image description. So we're working on ways to provide both of that to a user so that you could see it for low vision users, for cognitive users, as well as, you know, for traditionally for the visually impaired user as well. So that is work being currently done, and hope to see some exciting news on that in the next few months.
Valerie, any thoughts for you on the use of image descriptions by folk other than those who are using a screen reader, maybe text-to-speech software?
Yes, I completely agree with Charles in that if it's possible to provide more information and then allow the user to decide whether or not they want that extra information, if they have the option to opt in or opt out, that's the perfect scenario. Sometimes when someone is using text-to-speech software, they are a sighted individual or they have low vision. A lot of the people who order e-text from us are sighted. The vast majority of our users are people who have various learning disabilities, such as ADHD or dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia. So they are going to potentially prefer not to hear that extra information and opt out. But I think if you are going to the trouble of adding all that extra information for some users, those people who are auditory learners who are using e-text would benefit from it.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions now that relate to the artificial intelligence piece. So Gregorio, these are coming to you, but other folk on the panel are welcome to comment. So from James, James asks, how does the time used to review the AI created descriptions compared to a human just doing the descriptions in the first place?
Yeah. So first of all, our work, the work we've done with it's just a pilot project, so it is not ready for production, and we are not testing it for production. But I think that the first part of the tool, which is the classifier, could be really, really useful. Because if we can get to a good level with the classifier, a good level of accuracy with the right data sets, then we can speed part of the workflow. Because if by correctly classifying the image, we can forward the image to the correct workflow. For example, for some images, we could try to use automatic description, for example, for icons, while for other type of images, for example, for graphs, we may require human description. So I think that if we will improve the classifier, we can benefit in terms of time. But for a full automatic description, I think it will still take time. We need the technology to improve. Also because the description, it is not a standalone text, but it depends on the context. So the tool has to understand not the image itself, but the context where the image is inserted.
And Juliet asked the question, well, computer vision's been used for decades, of course, with optical character recognition to recognize text. Do you see the potential of combining both OCR together with machine learning, artificial intelligence for the images that are within that text?
Sure. Actually, some OCR software already use artificial intelligence to manage the text recognition. And we tested the Google's tool, which is Cloud Vision API, which does a great job for text recognition and image recognition. So I think that both technologies can work together to get the best results.
And
So that's
Richard,
an example. Yeah, go ahead, Charles. Yeah.
Actually, at Benetech, we're doing just that. We're for Bookshare, we are starting a project called Math Detective that will take a book that has mathematical equations as images in the book and going through a classifier, like Gregorio said, determining that if this image is math related or not, and then sending it through AI and doing that recognition, the OCR recognition, and getting that text of the math, and then putting it back into the book as MathML that can be spoken and be understood, instead of just hearing an image that usually it didn't even have alt text descriptions for those mathematical equations, but being able to put that mathematical equation back into the book accessibly is a project that we're working on right now at Benetech. So yeah, it's really cool.
Now, we heard from our presenters and from the feedback from publishers about the great guidelines that are produced and the care that's taken to craft image descriptions with subject matter experts and so on. So lots of effort going into this. Katie asked the question, do you know whether there's any user-centered data or studies that look at the user feedback on image descriptions?
I can answer this one. So yes, there is a lot of user-centered data, but of course, when you talk to people, you're going to get as many different data points and opinions as there are people involved in the study, sometimes more. So I would start with maybe Googling cognitive load and auditory fatigue, and that is where I like to concentrate my efforts, because it really helps me. It helps me in trainings, and it helps me learn more about user feedback of alt text description. So that's one way in that you can find some information. There are lots of other different entities that conduct studies all the time on image description, and over the years we've received a lot of feedback from students using our alt text descriptions, and so of the publishers as well. And so there's a lot of information out there. I'm currently working on a white paper on cognitive load and image description myself. But there is a lot of data out there. However, there's a lot to wade through, and depending on the user's disability, they're going to have far different needs from one another. So when I'm writing my alt text, or when I'm challenged with a project, I'm trying to find as much information about that end user as possible. And it's really hard to cover all the bases.
Thank you. So in this last segment, we're going to focus on the topic of extended descriptions. Question from Joseph is, when you're including an extended description in a publication, what's the best practice for indicating this in the alt text itself? And some of this might need a bit of explanation in your answer. So Charles, do you want to take this one?
That's actually a great question, because you want a simplified description in the alt text, and then usually the extended description follows it in some type of like HTML summary details. But in order to point out that there is a following description, Valerie, I'm assuming you could say that see the extended description following, or have you come across this in the past?
Yes, so the way we do this is probably not going to answer Joseph's question the way he wants it answered. But so I am in the business of remediating content for a specific user. So I'm not making the final publication. So in terms of How it would appear in a final professional publication, I can't really answer to that. But what we do is we in-house will create, we ask the user or the customer who comes to us saying, I need this textbook. We will ask them what level of alt text description they need, and then that is what we provide. So if, for instance, they want a blind user would want their textbook or course materials or publication, they would want it conveyed in or converted into a Microsoft Word doc. We would ask them whether they wanted brief alt text or long comprehensive alt text. If they want the brief alt text, we would put it in the image, we would embed it in the image itself, and then trust that the screen reader isn't going to cut off because we have brief alt text descriptions. But if they prefer a long comprehensive description, we would leave the alt text of the figure blank, and then in the document itself we would say begin alt text, write out the comprehensive description, and then end alt text, so that it's not going to get cut off. But that does not, however, answer your question about how it would appear in a professional publication.
And actually, I just remembered that the use of aria-details is exactly for this construct, so that you have the alt text with the image, and then you have an aria details with a link to where the extended description is, and it's up to the AT to announce that has details, so that you know that there's additional information. So I believe that's what Joseph would be looking for in this case, and that works both in EPUB as well as on the web.
Now we're out of time, but Kevin did ask a couple of questions about extended descriptions. I want to just check, Charles, do you know, Kevin is asking the question about how you describe content without giving away the answer to a test question. Is this something that's covered in the POET tool or in the guidelines that are on the Diagram Center?
I'm not sure, actually. That's a great question. I know that it's something that we struggle with, and actually that's probably something that ETS might have some insights in on how to craft those alt text descriptions and not give away the answer. So we'll have to take a look and see if there's any resources out there to help with that.
Great. Well, we'll take a look. We'll see if we can find some resources and we'll post those to the resources page. Sorry, Kevin, we didn't quite give your answer the time it justified. But we're coming to the end of this session. Valerie, Charles, and Gregorio, thanks for sharing great information and insights. And thank you to everyone who joined us for today's session. Coming up in the next few weeks, we have some more wonderful topics for you. On June the 24th, we have another requested topic, which is metadata in publishing, the hidden information essential for accessibility. On July the 1st, we'll hear about initiatives that are underway in different regions of the world to bring accessible publishing to reality. We'll contrast these different approaches, and I anticipate an interesting discussion on which will be the most successful model in our world tour of inclusive publishing initiatives. On July the 8th, pack your bags, we're going on a trip as we follow the journey from publisher to student and experience the accessible EPUB ecosystem in action. As always, you can find out more information at daisy.org/webinars, and I hope you'll join us again next week. And in the meantime, thank you for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.